and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a journalist, editor and co-founder of the annual Iceland Writers' Retreat. After her upbringing in Ottawa, she studied at Oxford University, obtaining a master's degree in modern history. She moved to Iceland in 2003 with her partner. In 2016, her by now husband was elected president of Iceland, and she became the First Lady, taking on the patronage of numerous organisations and the role of the United Nations Special Ambassador for Tourism and the Sustainable Development Goals. During her tenure, she brought gender equality and inclusion to the forefront in Iceland through opinion pieces, TED Talks and keynote speeches to audiences around the world, including political figures and royalty. She's been the editor for Iceland Air's In-Flight magazine, a staff writer at Iceland Review, and has written for many publications, including the New York Times and Monocle itself. Her first book, Secrets of the Spraker, Iceland's Extraordinary Women and How They Changed the World, was an instant bestseller in both Canada and Iceland and translated into numerous languages. Her new novel is Death of a Diplomat. It's a whodunit novel involving ambassadors from business and politics. The strapline says, 9 people sit down to dinner and murder is on the menu. Eliza Reid, thank you so much for coming in. Welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
What an exciting backstory you have. Can we start in Ottawa?
We sure can. Absolutely. That's the best place to start.
Tell me about your upbringing.
So I grew up, it's really what we call in Canada sort of a hobby farm, which means that my parents had it as a hobby. So when I was 10 years old, we moved from the suburbs of Ottawa, a little bit more out to the countryside, to a somewhat ramshackle old farmhouse where we also then had sheep and chickens and ducks. And then I went into school in the city. And my parents still live there, just outside of Ottawa. And we had a wonderful upbringing. My father is a English literature professor, and my mother is a very gifted storyteller. You know, one of these people who can just spin a yarn out of anything. You know, going to the grocery store that day or something like that. And so we grew up really in a very story-filled environment. Not that I had an ambition to be a writer, but I have a younger brother who is also a writer, and it was just certainly a storytelling household, which taught me the importance of storytelling and how that teaches us about ourselves.
And so when did you first start writing?
Well, gosh, I mean, I certainly wrote a lot when I was a kid, just for fun and keeping diaries. And I was an avid reader as a child, and an avid, this is going to make me sound extremely interesting, I was an avid book organizer. So I loved to put little labels on my books and number them and loan them out to my brothers, whether or not they wanted to borrow them, and do ranking systems of how much I liked the different books. But I certainly enjoyed the literary world from a young age, absolutely.
Right. Schooling in Canada?
Yep, schooling in Canada. Regular years when I was 18, finished secondary school, I went to the big city, to Toronto, to the University of Toronto, where I did a degree in international relations, which also turned out to be fairly helpful. It's a combination of history, political science, and economics. And many people who studied IR went on to work for the Foreign Service in Canada. And I maybe thought about that for a moment, and then I thought, but that would mean I'd have to move back to Ottawa, my hometown, for a few years. And when you're 22, that sounded like the least interesting thing when there was a big wide world out there. So instead, I thought, well, I don't really know what I want to do. I'll go to graduate school, and got into Oxford. And I think when you get into Oxford, that's where you go. Moved over here to the UK to do a master's degree in modern history at St. Antony's College, which was it's a graduate only college and very international. So there was many people there from Canada. We were not very interesting. And I remember people talking and saying, and you know, there's even someone here from Iceland. And that was in the last century. So it wasn't that there was EasyJet flights many times a week up to Iceland. And it was, I didn't really know anything about the country other than what its flag looked like. And so one day I met this man from Iceland, and I remember saying, "Oh, you're the guy who's from Iceland," and he formed my whole stereotypes about the whole nation, really.
So, what was your first impression of the man who would become your husband?
Well, I thought I certainly didn't realize he would become my husband right away. I mean, I thought he was smart, but pretty much everybody that I was interacting with there was pretty smart and interesting, and had a very dry sense of humor, which I think, plays very well, obviously, here in the UK as well. And he, studious, he was starting his DPhil. And we both rowed for the college, and that might sound impressive, but we were all foreign graduate students, and we were not a very impressive crew overall, but we thought that's a very Oxford-sounding thing to do. And one evening, there was a fundraiser for the rowing crew and at a party, and the fundraiser involved, if I recall correctly, the men on the team had these sort of paper cups that they had written their own names on. And then the women, or whoever wanted to, could pay £1, and we would get 5 paper tickets that we would mark with our own name, and then we would put them in one of the cups, and the men would draw a name out and have to take the person out on a date. And I remember thinking, well, this is my carpe diem moment, because he, Goodney, my now husband, was one of the people who had these cups. And I thought, well, this is a nice guy, and I'd like to get him to know him a bit better. But, who knows how long these things can take. And so I remember I had a £2 coin, and I thought, what the heck, I'm just going to get 10 tickets. And I put 8 of them in his cup. And I thought, I don't want to put them all in, because then if the truth came out, I'd be like a stalker or something. But I thought, sometimes you have to give fate a little bit of a push. And then I thought, if he draws my name, how much can I really be committing myself to in this sense? How long term can this be? And so inevitably he drew my name. And we went out for dinner the next night. He took me to Luna Capresi's on North Parade, for anyone who happens to know Oxford, which was a well-known Italian restaurant. And so most of the people had a kebab at some point in the van outside the college. And so I remember after that dinner thinking, now, does this mean he likes me, or are all Icelandic men like this? Because, again, I didn't know anybody from Iceland. And that was, we've been married for over 20 years now. And that was probably over 25 years ago now when this first happened.
So he did like you.
He did like me.
Meanwhile, though, of course, your career is progressing. You leave Oxford. What do you do next?
So, yes, I graduated. I started working here for Delarue, the banknote printers, on their graduate recruitment scheme. Meanwhile, Goodney, who was then my boyfriend, was finishing his doctorate degree. And he has a daughter from his first marriage. And so when he was finished his studies, he was going to go back to Iceland to be close to her while she was growing up. And so the question was, do we... if we want to be together, we go and build a life for ourselves in Iceland. And so we decided to do that in 2003, just over 20 years ago. He decided to move back. And before I did, I thought, well, I'm moving to this new country where I don't have a job and I don't speak the language, and I might as well be broke as well. And so I sold my stock options and kept my savings, and I traveled for 100 days around Central Asia and Southeast Asia and Mongolia and places. And meanwhile, my lovely husband, who had become my fiance, found a flat for us to live in Iceland. And so after spending all my money, I then arrived broke in Iceland, ready to build a new life, which I thought might involve getting married, which we did a year later, possibly having a family. We had 4 children in just under 6 years.
Twins?
No twins. Just four children at 2-year intervals. Yeah, 3 boys and a girl. And I got a job. I was made redundant from my job. I took Icelandic classes. All of these things that people encounter in life as we build our lives together.
How easy did you find it to integrate into society there?
In many ways, I sort of fall into the most privileged category in a sense of immigrant, because I was moving because of an Icelandic partner. So in a sense, I had access to his network, which was certainly very helpful, but it was always important to me. I knew, of course, I moved to Iceland for love. I moved there for him, but I wanted to stay for me. I wanted to make sure that I had my own raison d'etre in the country, to know that I had my own friends, my own fulfilling career, and my own life there as well. I started learning the language kind of as soon as I went, and I think that was very helpful as well, just to show that I was really invested in the country.
Is it a difficult language to learn?
I learned French in school in Canada when I was young, but otherwise I'd never learned a language as an adult. So I can't compare it to too much. I think as far as European languages go, it's pretty complex. And perhaps an additional challenge is the fact that English is very widely spoken. So if English is your first language, it's, you couldn't easily function there without learning a single word of Icelandic. But then you don't really kind of get under the skin of the society. So I just tried to learn that, and it was I think it's fair to say it was a sort of personal setback to me to be made redundant from my job after a year. I think it's not an uncommon situation that people have found themselves in, but it can be difficult. But like so many unexpected moments in life, you also it kind of pivots your life in a way that maybe is better overall. So it inevitably led to me kind of leaving the corporate world. And I started just picking up freelance projects. And that's really where I started writing, mostly just to pick up different assignments. And then I realized that I really liked it and ended up kind of pivoting more into that sort of journalism world.
And what was your husband doing at the time?
He had finished his PhD and he started lecturing at the university, sort of making his way up the academic ladder, I suppose you could say. He also published a number of books on the Anglo-Icelandic Cod Wars, for example, which is the subject of his thesis, as well as Icelandic political history. So he's an expert on sort of 20th century Icelandic politics and especially the constitution, different prime ministers and presidents.
The Icelandic writer Sjón told me that everybody in Iceland has published a book and has had a go at being in government.
I think that is not too much hyperbole. I would agree with that. So we have this wonderful phrase in Icelandic, að ganga með bók í maganum, which means to walk with a book in your belly. And this idea that everyone kind of has a story that we're waiting to give birth to. Yeah. And I love that idea. And certainly there is a tremendous respect for writers and for their written word. Maybe marginally less trust and respect in politicians. But I would believe him when I say that I think there is a statistic of people, in, say, municipal elections, that sort of 1 or 2% of the whole population who is a candidate in municipal elections.
Extraordinary, extraordinary. So then the Panama Papers.
Yeah.
And this changes your life completely.
Yes. And not maybe, if you hear the Panama Papers, you might think it changes my life for one reason, and it was not that reason. But yeah, so in 2016, I had cobbled together a kind of freelance income doing all kinds of writing projects. Our children were 2, 4, 6, and 8 years old. And I don't think I need to explain any more what that means. My husband had just reached tenure, sort of full professor level at the University of Iceland, and was finishing a book on the history of the presidents of Iceland. So this is our life in April 2016.
He's a quiet academic.
He is a quiet academic, exactly. The Panama Papers scandal breaks. It impacts our prime minister at the time. We have a prime minister and a president in Iceland. And of course, that's huge news. I mean, it was global news and a huge deal in Iceland. And ultimately, that prime minister ended up resigning. There was a number of protests that were outside Parliament the very next day. So, of course, the national news decided to, cut its regular programming and have a special that was just on what was breaking, because there was all kinds of ongoing stories of, would he resign and wouldn't he, and what was going to happen and when would elections be. And my husband was the pundit that they called on television to analyze the breaking news story. And as mentioned, he was writing a book on the presidents of Iceland. He has never been a member of a political party, so very neutral in terms of how he was presenting it, but could talk about the ongoing crisis in an accessible and interesting way. And he's on television for, I guess, about 6 hours. Now, at the time, there was a scheduled presidential election for June. So this is April. And in June, the presidential election was coming up. The outgoing president had announced he was not going to run. So for the first time in 20 years, the former president had served for 20 years, there was kind of a big open void as to who might fill those shoes. And that day, I'm at home with the 4 kids and, doing various things at home and working on my projects. And sometime after supper, the landline telephone rings, which is usually my mother or my mother-in-law. And this man asked to speak to Goodney. And I said, well, he's not here. And he said, well, I'm a resident of this elderly home in the West Fjords of Iceland, and I heard him on television today, and I was wondering if you'd pass on the message that I think he should consider running for president. He was very good. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of funny. Sure, I'll give him that message. And I go back to what I'm doing, and 15 minutes later, there's another phone call. And it's, oh, we're a group of police officers in this other town in the southeast, and we were watching your husband on television today, and, we would just like to give him the message that we think he should consider running for president. And I'm thinking, wow, 2 in one evening. This is so strange. And Goodney gets home, and I said, you wouldn't believe you've had these calls from strangers saying that you should run for president. They saw you on TV. And he takes out his phone, and he's got all these messages and text messages from people. And so this sort of grassroots effort to encourage him to run for president happened literally in sort of 24 to 48 hours. They say the truth is stranger than fiction, and I think this is a good example of that. So, within a couple of weeks, he's within a few days, he's having to think seriously, should I actually do this? Take this leap from quiet, solitary academia onto the global stage? Should I become the historian who is making history? And he decided to do that and won the election, and then served 2 terms with wonderful popularity, although I'm biased, of course.
What did you think? Did you think it was a good idea for him to do it? Did you want him to do it?
I did, yes. I hope I wasn't Lady Macbeth or anything, but no, it was first of all, I thought he would be great at it. And I thought it was so sudden and unexpected that I didn't really have time to contemplate all the ramifications. Not to say that we regret it in any way, but you get this moment, the stars have aligned, and you kind of have to go for it, even though it's a bit intimidating.
Now, you are a feminist. You have worked very hard for equality, for women's rights and so on, but thrust into a job where you are very much second fiddle, where you're discussed by what you're wearing and not what you're thinking. How did that work for you?
Well, Jacinta, it was very strange in that I had worked to build up this life for myself in my adopted homeland. And all of a sudden, I was nationally known as someone's wife. And I wondered what's happened to Eliza in all of this. And of course, I'm very proud to be Goodney's wife, but I wouldn't say it's my defining characteristic as a human being. And I think that was the strange balance that I felt once I fell into this role, which really isn't a role. It's not an official role. There's no handbook. There's no rule book. But there are also sort of unofficial expectations about what you'll do or how you'll look or how you'll dress. And I really wanted to use it as much as I could to talk about issues that I thought were important because people were listening all of a sudden. And yet I think ultimately ended up for me being about trying to confound expectations about female spouses of male heads of state. And, Iceland we're the world leader in gender equality. We're the closest in the world to closing the gender gap. And so I thought, well, what other better place to do this from than from Iceland? And so I tried to use my voice a lot and speak up and not become some kind of accessory to my husband's genius.
And you carried on working.
Absolutely, I did. I ran the Iceland Writers Retreat. I continue to run the Iceland Writers Retreat. And
Tell us about that.
Sure. It's an event I started just over 10 years ago with a friend where it's sort of literary tourism to Iceland. So for anybody who is interested in the craft of writing, whether they work as writers or they keep a diary at home, they come to Iceland and we bring over writers from around the world. And Sean, for example, in Iceland has taught for us. And they teach small writing workshops on the craft of writing. And then we have tours as well to introduce people to Iceland's literary heritage. But I also wanted to be active, and so I did hundreds of events a year in my capacity as First Lady as well.
And then your debut book, Secrets of the Spracker, became a bestseller. Tell us about that book.
Well, this, I guess, was the next step in my professional development, that I had been working as a journalist. I'd been speaking up about gender equality. I wrote quite a popular piece in the New York Times about serving as First Lady. They called it an incredibly weird job. And in the pandemic, when everything shifted, I think I all of a sudden had the time that this idea came to me to thought, if Iceland is the closest country in the world to closing the gender gap, how can I explore what that means for regular women in the country, and how can I make that inspiring to people elsewhere? And so it's really a love letter to my adopted country and hopefully an introduction to the nation, but it's comprised of about 40 different interviews of all sorts of women, but not Bjork or not, our first female president, but people who I think we can all relate to a little more, but yet teach us something different. And I hope they are inspiring stories to talk about why working towards greater gender equality is something that is important for everyone.
And as I say, it did extremely well.
It did well, yeah. I mean, and gosh, I said writing a book, it's like putting on a bikini and then standing in front of the world and saying, "Okay, people, what do you think?" And I know this is a podcast and not television, but I will tell you that I do not usually wear bikinis, so it felt uncomfortable in that sense. But I think it struck a chord, and I hopefully, again, I wanted to write a book that made people hopeful when they finished reading it, and made people hopeful and happy and galvanized, not angry and frustrated.
Well, your next book, it's your first novel. It's a whodunit.
Yeah,
and it, I think, also makes people feel good. It's just one of those. I kind of want to call it cozy crime, but that's a very British genre, and I'm not sure it is that, because you've got the raw Icelandic weather and all sorts of things going on. But it's a fabulous book, and it's very much. It feels like one of those golden age, almost Agatha Christie-esque.
I mean, Agatha Christie was definitely my favorite author when I was growing up. And I could never say that I could write like Agatha Christie, but I loved her books, at least. The books where you get a cast of characters, you meet them all at the beginning, and you know at the end, again, ideally at the end, you have this sort of denouement where everyone comes together. And I feel that gives the reader a running start to maybe guess what happened. You know that the whodunit, the murder, isn't going to be an alien who dropped from space on page 200.
Yeah.
And hopefully, of course, they won't guess it. But also, this is the first in a series, so I hope that it's really introducing people to some characters that they would like to meet later on. Because I also think what distinguishes, I have good whodunits. You have a good plot. You want to know what's happened. You want to know what's solved, but you get invested in the people and what's happening.
And you draw these characters very fully. The main protagonist, Jane, and her husband, Graham. Now, he is a Canadian diplomat. He's the ambassador of Canada to Iceland. She's his wife. Some similarities here.
Some similar, although I have to say, just in those premises and not at all in the characters, for both of us in that sense. Well, they say to write what you know. And I don't know murder, I will say up front, but I do know Iceland. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of encountering many diplomats over the last numerous years when I was serving as First Lady. And so in a sense, it's a bit of an homage both to Iceland as a country and a wonderful setting for these kinds of books, but also to public service and diplomacy. And I think it's a wonderful segment for this, because it's this old tradition and it's all about game faces. You're going to do one thing, but you also have an ulterior motive, but that's all right. And this heroine, Jane, who is the wife of the ambassador, she's kind of sick of that. She's a little bit sick of the two-facedness of it. And she's sick of following her husband around the world. And I thought this is something that maybe some people can relate to or not. And I wanted to play a little bit with this idea of game faces, of how we have to put on one image for another, but also how women are often underestimated and kind of put into boxes by their roles.
I found it a tremendous read. It was very. It's kind of addictive. It's fast-paced. It's and it's clearly crying out for a sequel.
Yes. Well, I'm 54,071 words into the sequel. Not that I'm paying attention, really.
And I have to know, any plans to write a memoir of your time?
Yes. In fact, I've been doing the two sort of simultaneously. So I have a memoir coming out next year as well about my time as First Lady.
Absolutely excellent.
I can't decide if I like writing fiction or nonfiction, so I'll just continue with both.
Excellent. There is one more question I just need to put in, which is, what language do you write in?
I write in English.
And is it then translated into Icelandic?
It's then translated into Icelandic. And both of my books have come out first in Icelandic, but in translation.
And how have they done in Iceland?
Very well. I mean, they've both been... Death of a Diplomat was an instant #1 bestseller and was a best-selling book in April for the whole month when it's come out. I do admit, with my Canadian modesty, that fewer books are sold in April, so I feel like I have to say that. But it did well when it came out. And also the same with Secrets of the Sprakkar. And Sprakkar is an Icelandic word, means extraordinary women. And I kind of reintroduced that word into the vocabulary because it was quite old. And I think that was people thought well of that.
Eliza Reid, I think you're a Sprakkar.
Oh, thank you. Likewise.
Death of a Diplomat is published by Sphere in the UK. It's out now. It's by the amazing Eliza Reid. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer Steph Chungu and also to Tom Webb. You can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.